The protests are big. I mean, the number can go up to hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions. Most of them are saying they won't have another Lula presidency. But his hardcore supporters have been saying throughout the campaign that he precisely is planning on going hard left. The São Paulo Forum was created by Lula and Fidel Castro in 1990, and the whole idea was to reclaim in Latin America what was lost in Eastern Europe, to reclaim the revolutionary movement, the FARC, the hard left communist guerrilla, the narco-trafficking groups. You had even links to the Shining Path. I mean, the terrorist movement in Peru, which has gotten thousands killed. And that is not positive to the United States in a number of ways. The socialist regimes throughout Latin America have been deliberately working to flood the southern border with drugs and all sorts of criminals.
Good evening. Welcome to NTD's Fresh Look America. I'm Paul Graney. With it all but certain that Lula da Silva will become Brazil's next president, what are the implications not just for South America, but for the United States? Marcus Schotgues is the editor-in-chief of Epoch Times Brazil. He's working on a documentary series about Brazil. The first episode is called Red Tide, Latin America's New Left Turn. It highlights soon-to-be President da Silva's links to far-left organizations. The series will be available soon on Epoch TV. Marcus, great to speak with you. Thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
We see pretty significant protests still happening in Brazil. What are they, like 2 months since the election already? Why are people still in the streets?
I mean, people started going to the streets the day the results were coming out. We've been covering this on the ground, and we've talked to some of the protesters. And basically, most of them are saying they won't have another Lula presidency. Let's remember Lula was president from 2003 up to 2011. And many people are claiming they don't want Lula to come back. Lula has, after he left the presidency, been convicted on money laundering and corruption charges, and he was then released on procedural grounds, not on the merit of the accusations, by a Supreme Court justice. He himself, actually his party, Dilma Rousseff, who came after him at the office, has nominated. So people are basically saying they won't have another Lula administration. Now, what exactly is being claimed at the protests is controversial to an extent. Some, perhaps the majority, are calling for military intervention or for the military to at least do something so another Lula administration doesn't come up. And the protests are big. I mean, we're talking thousands of people in front of military infrastructure, camping day and night, and on holidays and weekends. The number can go up to hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions.
Are they doing damage, Marcus, or are they peaceful?
Now, the protests in front of the military infrastructure are peaceful. I haven't seen any incidents of violence there from what I've been covering. There have been minor reports of violence in specific points in Brazil, but they're mostly peaceful. And even going there, these are not like the regular kind of people you'd imagine on a protest. These are not your Antifa, BLM people burning courthouses. I mean, whole families are there, lots of children, mothers, people I know personally have been there. And I mean, people who you'd never see in a protest are there. Now, it's worth noting that there have been some instances where truckers have blocked highways, and those were less peaceful incidents, but the majority of the protests, which are in front of military headquarters throughout Brazil, have been peaceful, and they're very orderly. Lots of families, lots of communities gathering there.
What do you think will happen when Lula takes power, takes control of the military? How are these protests going to be dispersed?
Yeah, I mean, this is a cause for concern there. Many people who were supporting Lula, even people who were moderate leftists, were expecting him to take a more pragmatic approach, not to go hard left. But his hardcore supporters have been saying throughout the campaign that he precisely is planning on going hard left. Some of his closest supporters have said that. I mean, even one of his closest advisors, José Dirceu, who is a trained Cuban agent. He was in Cuba, trained in Cuba twice in the 70s as a communist guerrilla. And this is one of Lula's closest advisors. He himself, back in 2019, was talking about the possibility of Lula going into a socialist presidency in the future. Now, many fear for what might happen, the possibility of him going authoritarian, which he hasn't done in the past, but many say he might attempt now. and he has ties to authoritarian regimes, Nicaragua, Cuba, and others. How are they going to be dispersed? We don't know. Many say if he intends to go hard left, that he might hold on for a few months, perhaps a few years into the presidency before he takes that radical turn. What we're seeing is that he's pretty much picking up where PT, his party, the Workers' Party, left off in 2016 when Dilma Rousseff, who was in the presidency at the time, was impeached, which is going increasingly hard left.
Well, the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, he did put up somewhat of a fight. His supporters still putting up somewhat of a fight. It looks like the presidency, though, barring something extraordinary, will go to Lula, as you said. Brazil will take a turn to the left. What is the significance of this, not only to Brazil, but for us here in North America?
Well, the significance is huge. I mean, Latin America has been shifting left for a while now, and that is not positive to the United States in a number of ways. I'll start with the most important ones. I mean, Latin America is a key source of critical materials. I'll give an example. Brazil holds 17% of rare earth mineral reserves in the world. I mean, Vietnam and other Southeastern Asian nations hold a percentage of that as well. And then China has about 44%. So with increasing Russian and Chinese influence in Latin America, basically they're getting this critical material, which is used to produce microchips, to produce jet fighters, and all sorts of critical pieces, basically into the sphere of influence of the Chinese and the Russians. So it's huge leverage for American adversaries. Now, another key issue there, and the rare earth minerals are just one example. There are plenty of critical materials going on. Now, another example is the southern border. It will have direct impact on America because all of the socialist regimes throughout Latin America have been deliberately working to flood the southern border with drugs and all sorts of criminals. I mean, we've seen what's going on in Texas and other southern states. The border is in chaos for a few years now. And I'll just give an example to get some facts there. Now, the Center for a Secure Free Society, a reputable US think tank, quoting official data and other sources, said that about 25% of worldwide cocaine trade goes through Venezuela. Now, migrants, they have complicated routes to get to the southern border. And with Brazil under the sphere of influence of these regimes, which are undermining America and which are conceding to Russian and Chinese influence.
So you're saying that it's primarily socialist countries in South America that are intentionally sending criminals to the southern border of America to destabilize it. Are you saying that under Bolsonaro, this practice was limited or not happening?
I mean, it was reduced to a certain extent because Bolsonaro is adversarial to socialist nations, mainly Venezuela, around us. Now, the Chinese leverage, the Russian leverage are so big in Latin America, it's basically impossible for a country to fully contain their influence or to fully oppose all countries around it. I mean, it's not diplomatically reasonable to expect that, and it's not what has happened. But it did limit, to a certain extent, the freedom which these adversarial regimes had to operate and to try to undermine America. And yes, what I am saying is those regimes are intentionally trying to undermine America with criminals and drugs in the southern border. But it's not me saying that. You can hear their own confessions. You can get criminals which were caught at the border in the late 80s, in the early 90s, and they all confess that. Even Fidel Castro from Cuba, former bodyguard, says how much he was into the drug trade and how he was collaborating to politically get those criminals and drugs there. This is all documented in a book by Joseph Douglas from the US intelligence community, a 1990 book called Red Cocaine. In the 1999 re-edition of this book, Douglas talks about how no refutation of the book has been attempted because none is possible. He's talking of a primary source, a general from communist Czechoslovakia who defected between the 60s and 70s. And he talks about, because he was primarily involved, he himself was there. He's quoting from his primary experience. Now he talks about how they had what they call revised basic revolutionary strategy, which is basically a master plan to get Latin America to be a source of drugs and to basically target enemy countries, what the Soviets, what the communists called enemy countries, with drug trade, terrorists, and migrants.